Me, right? Introduction.
Yes.
Okay, can I start?
Yeah.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Today, this is regarding the understanding the relationship between the lending rate, inflation, and GDP is essential for the making informed financial and policy decision. Through this study, we aim to uncover significant economic trends and their implication on Malaysian economic development. As an introduction, this study examines the relationship between the lending rates, the consumer price index (CPI), and gross domestic product (GDP) over the past 25 years. And also, economic indicators such as these are vital in assessing a country financial health. And Malaysia economic history includes booms, crises, and policy shift influencing this indicator. The objective of this study will be the primary objective of this study will be analyzing the historical trend and relationship among the Malaysian lending rates, CPI, GDP growth over the past period 1999 to 2023. So they're analyzing historical trends and relationship among these three things. We have utilized data from the World Development Indicator WID database, provide insight into how these economic indicator interact over the years, and also evaluate economic implication for businesses, consumers, and policymakers, and lastly provide insight into Malaysia monetary policy responses to economic events. The importance of analyzing lending rates, CPI and GDP. First of all, on the interest rate on lending rates, affecting borrowing cost, investing, and overall economic activity. Higher rate makes more borrowing. Higher rates makes borrowing more expensive, slowing economic expansion, and also while lower rates encouraging investment and growth. And CPI will be measure inflation, in, impacting purchasing power, household spending, business cost. And stable inflation is crucial for economic stability. GDP will be indicates Malaysian economic health, reflecting periods of growth, stagnation, and recovery. It helps assess the effective of fiscal and monetary policies. So together, this indicator provide valuable insight into Malaysia financial stability, guiding policymaker, businesses, and consumer in making informed decision. Next slide. So that data that we have gathered from WDI database, a globally recognized and reliable economic data repository, which is covers Malaysia economic trends from 1999 to 2023, capturing the monetary and fiscal policy changes that have influenced key economic indicator. This reflects Malaysia economic evaluation, including post-Asian financial crisis recovery, 1999 to 2000, which high interest rate to stabilize the economy. Secondly, global financial crisis, 2008 to 2009, lower interest rate to stimulate the recovery. And the third one will be COVID-19 pandemic, 2020 to 2021, which is historical low interest rate to support economic recovery. And the last one, post-pandemic adjustment, 2002 until 2023, which is raising the rates to control inflation and stabilize the growth. So this study going to highlight Malaysian economic resilience and the impact of monetary policy on the growth, inflation, financial stability, and offering data-driven insight from the economic planning and decision making. I pass next session to Shami.
So my part is started with the objective. So the primary objective of the data collection is to compile 25 years of economy data on lending rate, consumer price index, CPI, and gross domestic product, GDP, for Malaysia. This data set will serve as the foundation for analyzing long-term economic trend and identifying potential relationship among these key macroeconomic indicators. To ensure accuracy and reliability, the data will be sourced from the World Development Indicator (WDI) database, a well-established and widely used resource maintained by the World Bank. The WDI database provides comprehensive, standardized economic data that enable meaningful cross-country and time series analysis. By collecting the analyzing this variable, this study aimed to, the first is identify trend in Malaysia's economic performance over the past 25 years. Second is examine the relationship between lending rate, inflation, CPI, and GDP growth. And the last one is that assess the impact of major economic events such as 1997 Asian financial crisis, the 2008 global financial crisis, and the COVID-19 pandemic on Malaysia economy. This data-driven approach will support informed discussion and insight in subsequent section of the study, including trend analysis, regression analysis, and economic interpretation. So next slide is this is from the raw data I convert to my own table so that we can analyze it more easily. So next slide, please. So this is the lending rate, also known as an interest rate loan, is the percentage of interest charged by financial institutions such as bank when they lend money to borrower. It represents the cost of borrowing fund and is typically expressed as an annual percentage. The data on Malaysian lending interest rate from 1999 to 2023 shows significant trend and key observation. The highest lending rate was recorded in 1999 at 8.563%, reflecting a period of high borrowing costs, likely linked to the aftermath of the 1997 Asian financial crisis. In contrast, the lowest rate occurred in 2021 at 3.444%, indicating aggressive monetary policy easing during the COVID-19 pandemic to support business and household. Over the 25 years, the average lending rate was 5.452%. Overall, the data highlight Malaysia's effort to balance economic stability through dynamic monetary policy. Lowest rate in recent years have supported borrowing and investment, benefiting citizens and businesses. While period of higher rate reflect the central bank's strategies to manage economic challenge, this trend provide value insight into the relationship between lending rate and Malaysia economic growth. So for the more detail, Jessica will explain. So the next slide, please. So this is consumer price index, which is CPI. It's a key economic indicator used to measure the average change in price paid by consumer for goods and services over time. It helps track inflation to understand how the cost of living evolve in the economy. To see the inflation rate, the formula is in the slide need to be used to find the inflation rate by CPI data. So as we can see, the formula is CPI current year minus CPI previous year divided by CPI previous year times 100. So we can see the inflation rate at the table. So when we refer to CPI based year 2010 equal to 100, it means that the year 2010 is used as the reference point or benchmark for comparison. In this case, the CPI for 2010 is assigned a value of 100 and price in other year are compared relative to this base year. So the average inflation rate over this 25-year span is 2.101%, which support relatively stable inflation. Overall, a moderate inflation rate around 2% is generally considered healthy for an economy, as it indicates steady economic growth without excessive price increase. Next slide, please. So this is the GDP, which gross domestic product is the total monetary value of all goods and services produced within the country borders over a specific period, usually a year or a quarter. It is a primary indicator used to measure the health and size of an economy. So the GDP growth data from 1999 to 2023 illustrated the economic performance of Malaysia over a 25 years period, showing both period of expansion and contraction. The average GDP growth rate during this time is 4.712%, which indicates steady economic growth despite significant fluctuation caused by global and domestic events. Overall, the data highlight Malaysia's economic resilience, its ability to recover from crisis, and the challenge of maintaining consistent growth in the face of external and internal shock like COVID-19 pandemic and the others. So for analysis and summarize of the data will be explained in details by Jason.
All right, thank you, Shami. So I'll be presenting some of the analysis in detail as Shami already presented like a general one. So we can see that the lending rate for Malaysia is actually on an average of 5.5%. This is actually a healthy rate. And then while the minimum lending rate is around 3.4%, and it happens in year 2021, while the max lending rate is around 8.6% in the year 1999. So based on the observation, we can actually did separate them into like 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6 spans. Okay, so the first one is actually post-Asian financial crisis. So it happens around 1999 to 2000. So during this period, the lending rates remain the highest. So we achieved like around 8.56% in 1999, as the BNM actually maintained a tight monetary policy to stabilize the economy, to actually restore confidence among people. And then next is the early 2000s recovery from 2001 and to 2007. So the lending rates actually declined, and because this is due to the economy recovery and the inflation being stabilized. While the next stage is financial crisis. So this is around 2008 and 2009. So the Bank Negara actually reduced the lending rates to stimulate the economy, and then the rates actually fall to around 5.1% in 2009. While 2010s, it shows that there's a stability, as Malaysia actually experienced moderate economic growth and low inflation up to 2019. And then while 2020, COVID-19 actually happened, and then the lending rates actually hits a historic low of 3.44% in 2021. And then BNM actually implemented some strategies, and then it's actually an aggressive monetary policies to actually ease our economic recovery. And then after that pandemic, the lending rate actually bounced back, and then as this is due to Bank Negara actually normalized the monetary policy. Yep. All right. Next slide, please. So there goes our CPI. The CPI is actually used to measure the inflation rate. So as we can see it over here, the inflation rate among the years is actually quite healthy as well. So it's around 2.1% per year. And then in year 2020, we actually have a negative inflation rate of 1.14%, while the max inflation rate among 25 years is around 5.4% in year 2008. So let's go in depth by phases. So the first phase is actually the post-Asian financial crisis around 1999 to 2000, and then this is due to inflation remain being moderate, and this is as we actually recovered from the crisis, and the government actually implemented some structural reforms. And then the year 2000s, from 2001 to 2008, we can see that there's a rise in inflation rates, as this reflects some steady economic growth in Malaysia, and then it peaks at 5.4% in 2008. Yeah, and then after 2008, the inflation stabilized as the global commodity prices normalized. And then moving on next to GST, starting from 2015 to 2009, as the GST implemented in 2015, we can see that there's a spike in inflation from 2016 and 2019. And then the inflation actually normalized in the following year. This because as people already get used to it. And then in the year 2020, deflation occurred due to the pandemic. Yeah. And then after year 2020, inflation actually rebounded to averaging around 3.0% up to 2023. All right, next slide, please. So the last part is around GDP growth. So we can see that Malaysia GDP growth is also quite and on average, it's around 4.7%. It's really quite healthy. And then while we actually have a negative GDP growth in year 2020, while we actually achieve a maximum GDP growth of 8.9% in the year 2022. And then let's go in depth from 1999 first. So as I mentioned just now, this is due to financial crisis recovery in the year 1999 to 2000, and the GDP growth actually rebounded strongly. While the 2000 shows an economic expansion because we have a lot of strong exports and manufacturing including service sectors. Yeah, and global financial crisis occurs in 2008 and 2009, and then it causes a negative GDP growth of 1.5% in 2009, and it actually recovered quickly in the next year due to the government actually introduced some stimulus packages. While 2010 to 2019, the trend actually reflects Malaysia's transition to a more developed economy with a slower but a more stable growth. And then moving on next to global pandemic, and then this is what I mentioned just now, that we actually achieved a 25-year lowest rate of negative 5.5% due to lockdowns and the economic downturns in global stage. Yeah. Well, after 2021, we can see that the GDP growth actually rebounded, and then we reached a 25-year highest of 8.9% in 2022. All right, that's all for my part.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Now we're going to examine the economic indicator analysis by examining three key indicators, which is lending rates, the consumer price index, and also the GDP growth. So these indicators are essentially for understanding economic stability, inflationary trends, and also overall growth patterns in the country. The primary objective of this analysis is to explore how these indicators have evolved individually and also how they relate to one another. So as we delve into the data, as you can see, one of the major observations is that lending rates and CPI have shown fluctuating trends over time, impacted by various economic policies and also global financial conditions. Additionally, we can observe that CPI and GDP growth sometimes display an inverse relationship, suggesting that inflationary pressures may affect economic expansions. So furthermore, lending rates appear to correlate with inflation patterns, hinting at the central bank's role in managing inflation through monetary policy. Understanding these trends is crucial for policymakers, businesses, and also financial analysts, as they provide valuable insights into the country's economic health and future. So the first set of graphs illustrates the individual trends of each indicator. By looking at these graphs separately, we can observe how lending rates have fluctuated over time, how CPI has responded to inflationary pressures, and also how GDP growth has impacted by domestic and international economic conditions. In the second set of graphs, we have overlay representations to better understand relationships between these indicators. The lending rates versus CPI graph highlights how interest rates policies have influenced inflation. When lending rate rises, then the borrowing becomes more expensive, often slowing down inflation. So conversely, when lending rates are low, inflationary pressures tend to increase due to higher borrowing and spending. So similarly, the GDP growth versus CPI graph provides insight into how inflation trend aligns with economic expansion. So there are instances where higher inflation coincides with lower GDP growth, indicating economic slowdowns, and also the other instances where controlled inflation fosters economic growth. So by analyzing these graphs, we can clearly see patterns that help us interpret economic shifts and also develop strategies for managing inflation and fostering growth. That's all for me.
Okay, hi everyone, I'm Divya here. So now let's take a look at the trends, the relationships between all the indicators that we are currently discussing. So first thing first, let's take a look at the interest rate trends. So as you can see, the graph here, it illustrates basically how Bank Negara Malaysia adjusted its interest rate in response to economic cycles, financial crises, and inflationary pressures. So in short, the interest rate have actually fluctuated due to both domestic and global economic conditions. So taking a look in detail, from 1999 to 2003, BNM kept interest rates high, which peaked at 8.56% in 1999 to restore stability post-Asian financial crisis. As the recovery progressed, the rates dropped to around 5.95% in 2005, supporting steady growth. Then, during 2008 to 2009 crisis, Bank Negara Malaysia, they actually they cut the rate to 5.08% to boost liquidity. Then from 2010 to 2019, the rates remained stable around 4.5 to 5% amid moderate inflation. Then in 2020, we had the COVID-19, and this triggered a sharp rate cut to about 3.44% in 2021. And this is to revive the economy. So post-pandemic, the inflation surged, leading BNM to raise rates to 5.32% in 2023, again to stabilize the prices. So in short, this trend shows that BNM uses interest rate adjustments as a key monetary policy tool. Lower rates during crisis, they stimulate economic activity, while the higher rates, they actually prevent overheating, and in turn, they control inflation. So what businesses and consumers, they have to do is basically to be aware of these rate changes as they affect borrowing costs, investment decisions, and even the consumer spending power. So moving on to the next slide. Here we are going to take a look at relationship between inflation and interest rates. So as you can see, this graph, it basically highlights whether BNM adjusts interest rates in response to inflationary pressures or prioritizes economic growth in certain periods. Okay, let's take a look at the graph again. So this time, from 1999 to 2023, inflation around 1.5% and interest rate, they declined. So both inflation and interest rate, they declined, allowing BNM to lower rates without fueling price hikes. Then during 2008 to 2009 crisis, the inflation spiked to 5.44%, but BNM rate cuts to support economic recovery. Then from 2010 to 2019, stable inflation around 2% kept the rates moderate around 4.5 to 5%. In 2020, again, because there's COVID, the lockdowns caused deflation around 1.14%, prompting rate cuts to boost spending. Then post-pandemic, rising inflation, which is 3.37% in 2022, led BNM to raise rates to around 5.32% in 2023 to prevent overheating. So this trend here, it basically confirms the positive correlation between inflation and interest rate. In short, higher inflation leads to rate hikes, while lower inflation allows for rate cuts. However, exceptions exist here where BNM, they prioritize economic recovery over inflation control, as seen from 2009 to 2020. For businesses, rising interest rate, they signal higher borrowing costs, while consumers, they face increased expenses on loans and mortgages. Okay, now slide number 3, please. I mean the next slide, sorry. Okay, here we are taking a look at the relationship between interest rates and GDP growth. So the graph here illustrates how monetary policy influences economic expansion and contraction. Now, going back to 1999 to 2000 timeframe, Malaysia experienced strong GDP growth around 8.86% in 2000, which is supported by lower interest rate that actually encouraged borrowing and investment. However, in 2008 to 2009, despite aggressive rate cuts to 5.08%, the GDP contracted to negative 1.5% in 2009, which highlights that monetary policy alone cannot fully offset a global recession. Similarly, in 2020, Malaysia's GDP shrank by negative 5.46% due to COVID-19 crisis, leading to BNM to implement record low interest rates, which is 3.44%, in order to support the economic recovery. Then finally, by 2022 and 2023, the GDP rebounded to 8.86%, prompting interest rate hikes to prevent overheating and control inflationary risk. Now, this trend here, it shows that lower interest rates generally boost GDP growth, but external shocks like financial crises and pandemics can limit their effectiveness. Businesses, for example, they benefit from lower borrowing costs during downturns, while consumers experience easier access to credit. However, when in case of economy recovering too quickly, rate hikes are necessary to prevent excessive inflation and speculative asset bubbles. Now, in conclusion, next slide, please. So in conclusion, this we are going to see how the relationship between interest rates, inflation, and GDP growth. So, in short, higher inflation leads to higher interest rate, while lower interest rate generally boosts economic growth. Additionally, strong GDP growth often drives inflation. These dynamics have important economic implications. So, as discussed earlier already, for businesses, lower rates means cheaper loans, more investments, whereas higher rates slow expansion. Then for citizens, low rates makes borrowing easier but reduce savings return, while inflation increases the cost of living. For policymakers, on the other hand, BNM uses interest rate adjustments to manage economic cycles with rate hikes in 2022 to 2023 aimed in controlling the inflation. So that is all from me. On to the next presenter, please. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Divya. Right. So next, I'd like to move on to the part regarding linear regression analysis. So first and foremost, the linear regression analysis in this case will have the GDP growth. Here we have three factors which are being studied, right? The GDP growth, lending interest rates, and consumer price index, which is a precursor to measuring inflation. To carry out our linear regression analysis, we will be focusing on GDP growth as the responding variable, or the responding variable, or in other words, the result, right? The y-axis. On the other hand, we will be using the lending rates and the consumer price index as a measure of inflation as the x-axis. So we will be comparing the x-axis to the y-axis, as correspondingly the GDP growth is a responding variable, whereas the other two are manipulated variables. So the expectation is that our expectation that we hope to get from this linear regression analysis is that GDP growth is affected or has a causal relationship with interest rates and the consumer price index, which is inflation, right? And our general expectation is that lower lending interest rates leads to higher GDP growth, whereas a higher inflation, or CPI, leads to higher GDP growth. Now we punch the data into our linear regression analysis, and we find that by using the ordinary least square methods, or in other words, y equal to beta naught plus beta 1 times x axis 1 plus beta 2 times x axis 2 plus an error factor, you get the straight line, right? So to summarize, without going into too much details regarding the regression analysis, the metrics that are highlighted are worth looking at as the r-squared value. We find that the r-squared value is very, very low. It's around 0.064, or in other words, only 6% of GDP growth is explained by the variation in lending interest rates and consumer price index, and is the same as for the adjusted r-squared. So it's at negative 2.1%. In other words, it still doesn't show a very good, a very good fit, the model to the data. And our statistics also show that this is about 0.74. Overall model is not statistically significant because our p-value is 0.48. And in order to have a good model fit, our p-value has to be lower than the confidence limit of 5%. So p must be less than 0.05. On the other hand, we can check the strength of the correlation between the lending interest rate and CPI coefficient. We find that the strength of the correlation is quite strong at 0.74, 0.7, almost 75%, meaning that a 1% increase in interest rate does correlate to a 75% rise in GDP growth. However, it is still not causally significant because the p-value is still very high. Again, we want our confidence interval to be at about 5%. Similarly, for CPI coefficient, we find that this has a much less impact. The correlation is much weaker. It's about 1%, meaning that a 1% change in CPI has about a 0.01% change in the GDP growth. In other words, it's very, very insignificant and weak at the same time. And as a result, the intercept at about negative 0.6 is the baseline GDP growth when all predictors are zero. Again, it's not meaningful here because we've proven that the model does not fit. Or in other words, that the linear regression has shown that GDP growth is at most very weakly related to the CPI. On the other hand, it could be strongly related to the lending interest rates, but the model here, a linear regression, does not prove this model to be successful, and the relationship is not significant. So what can we say from the linear regression analysis? There are 2 points, 2 major points, is that the weak predictor relationship between CPI and lending rates towards GDP growth. We can see that we cannot decisively say that CPI or lending rates contribute to GDP growth. And this is likely due to some of the other factors that we did not include in this study, such as exports, commodity prices, or foreign investments, FDI. We know these will have a growth. This will play a role in the GDP growth, but we didn't put them in this study. And it's also worth noting that the complex relationship between monetary policy, trade dynamics, and global market shocks are worth noting as well. Secondly, is about the Malaysian policy response. We know that at times of economic downturn, they managed to reduce the interest rates so that people have more money to circulate in the economy. So these effective interest rate reductions have also cushioned some of these GDP declines, right? So we cannot directly say that X causes Y, X causes a change in the GDP. So one of the reasons we see that this predictor relationship fails is because of the effective policy by BNM. And also the steady inflation control, CPI trends reflect a robust fiscal and monetary management. We see that this lack of a very big, fluctuation is due to good policy making, good fiscal responsibility by BNM. So in short, we can see that Malaysia's GDP growth appears weakly influenced by the lending rates and CPI trends in isolation. And we must consider broader factors such as oil prices, trade, which are more likely to drive economic performances than the factors that we stated here. So we have to recommend something on this, we have to do further research and to expand factors such as exchange rates, FDIs, and rather than looking at GDP growth as a whole, we can break them down into sectors. For example, in the manufacturing, in the oil and gas, what's the contribution to GDP growth looks like? Because we know that our CPI and lending rates may affect certain different industries at different rates than some other industries. So yeah, that's the implications from our linear regression. I'd like to move on to the last part, which is the conclusion.
Hi. Okay. Now that we have seen the whole relationship between interest rate, inflation, and GDP growth, we can look at the conclusion and the key takeaways. For businesses, interest rate plays a crucial role in business investment and expansion. When interest rates are low, business can borrow at a lower cost, which encourages more investments and business growth. However, when interest rates are increasing borrowing becomes more expensive and companies may slow down their expansion plans. For consumers, similarly, consumers are directly impacted by interest rate changes. When rates are low, it's easier to get housing loans, car loans, and other financing. However, low rates also mean lower returns on savings. On the other hand, when inflation is high, the cost of living increases, reducing consumers' purchasing power. For instance, in 2020, lower interest rates made borrowing cheaper, but inflation remained low. However, in 2023, as inflation rose to 3%, the cost of essentials like food and fuel increased, impacting household budgets. For policymakers like Bank Negara and government policymakers, balancing interest rate and inflation is key to economic stability. The central bank uses interest rate adjustments to manage inflation and economic growth. If inflation rises too quickly, rate hike help slow down excessive spending and stabilizing prices. In 2022 and 2023, BNM raised rates to control post-pandemic inflation and ensuring that price increases didn't spiral out of control. These decisions are crucial for maintaining economic stability. Okay, so we can conclude. We can see that when the interest rate, the relationship between interest rate and inflation, when the inflation is higher, interest rates are higher. Interest rates and GDP growth, lower rates, higher GDP growth. Inflation and GDP growth, higher GDP, higher inflation. In conclusion, understanding this relationship helps businesses plan their investments, consumers manage their finances, and policymakers inform decisions. Policymakers make informed decisions. Moving forward, as Malaysia's economic stabilizes, careful adjustments in monetary policy will be crucial for long-term economic growth. Thank you.